So we're going to go ahead and get started, and we'll integrate our other speakers as we go. And so I might actually start with you. Why don't we start with you, Kamal, if that's okay? So I think more than anybody here, you know a lot about the importance of disaster risk reduction as the head of the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. And so when you think about lessons learned around how to integrate disaster risk reduction into long-term planning as a way to build resilience in a country like India and in a region like South Asia, can you share a bit with us some of what you've learned about the importance of integrating that work into planning?
Thank you very much. I'm really happy to participate in this, and what a distinguished panel, really an honor. To start off, I just want to highlight three facts. The first is that globally, decade on decade, if you look at mortality from disasters, it's going down. That's a good news. Decade on decade, there is 50% reduction in number of people dying from disasters. In some countries, for some hazards, such as for cyclones in India, there is even more dramatic reduction in mortality, up to 98%. So I think that's the good news. By and large, across the world, if you live in a cyclone-prone area anywhere in the world, the chances of dying now are a third of what they were 15 years ago. So that's the good news. The bad news is that the impact in terms of number of people affected is escalating exponentially. The economic losses are increasing. Number of people losing their livelihoods is increasing. So there is something very strange happening here that, we celebrate when a cyclone occurs. Very few deaths occur, but we do not pay enough attention to hundreds of thousands of people who are in need of shelter, who are in need of more reliable systems of water supply, power, and so on. So I think that's the second thing. The third I want to say is that the aggregate impact of disasters is really very large. We put out a report earlier this year where we looked at not just the direct impact, so not just the cost of a bridge washed out, but also indirect impacts in terms of productivity losses. So if you put it all together, direct, indirect losses, loss of ecosystem services, it's something like $2.3 trillion every year. So if I have to relate it to, how big it is, it's about 2% of the size of the global economy. If growth has to drive our poverty reduction objectives, then it is really having a sizable impact. Now, to address this, basically, we need to do three things. One is that it is really important that risk analytics of what is the kind of risk we are looking at. We have to not just count losses that have occurred, but expected losses in a systematic way. We know we have good hazard models for floods and droughts and earthquakes and cyclones. We know where people live. We know where capital assets are. We know where economic activity is. So I would really like to see in a few years from now that as India puts out its economic survey just before the budget, let's have a page on that which basically talks about what is our contingent liability from disaster and climate risk, the physical disaster and climate risk. It is really important to do that because if we don't do that, we are trying to use a down escalator to go up. We may be making a lot of investment in renewables to have cleaner sources of energy, but those assets themselves are exposed to physical disaster and climate risk. We've seen how the solar panels, large solar farms, wind farms across the world have been blown away by strong winds. So we are trying to solve one problem while creating another. So it's really important that risk analytics is embedded in all our planning processes. The second is that we have to improve our regulation and standards for resilience. For some sectors, such as telecoms, we need to come up with standards which are relevant to our situation and which look at not just risk as it is now, but as it will be in the future. I just want to highlight that, when on the extremes, if the expected wind speed goes from 180 kilometers per hour to 200 kilometers per hour, their losses do not go up by 10%, they go up by 100%. So it's really important that we design for the future, our standards for all different hazards. You know, when we procure infrastructure, it is really important that asking for a certain level of resilience is part of the way infrastructure systems procurement happens. You know, there should be a level playing field. It should not be just about the minimum cost, but a minimum level of resilience as well. And finally, it is really important that how we finance disaster risk reduction, we actually provision for resilience. You know, there are multiple studies across the world. You invest $1 in prevention now, you get back $5, $12, $20, depending on the study you're looking at and the context you're looking at in terms of the avoided losses in the future. So I think if we did a good job of risk analytics embedded in our all planning, improve our standards and regulations, including regulating professions and financing, it will be great. I am really happy that many things are happening in India. You know, Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure is championing this cause, not just at home, but also across the world, including in smaller island developing states. There is a lot of stuff happening in India domestically. Now we have a predictable way of financing recovery, which is another important area, that we finance recovery in a manner that we build back better and we do not build back to how things were. So very encouraging. I think if India succeeds in getting its infrastructure story right in the resilience way, it will not just be important for India, but for the world. Remember, on this issue, the developed world and developing world are in the same boat. In India, we have to build new infrastructure. In other parts of the world, infrastructure systems are completing their life cycle. They need to sort of replace, upgrade their infrastructure. So there is a lot that the world, the global north and global south, can learn from the Indian infrastructure story if we get this right in terms of resilience. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much for that great intro there, highlighting the importance of risk analytics, standards, and financing. I may ask you, Mantek, building on that, you've been involved in many important planning processes here in India over the years.
Why don't I turn it on to my colleague, and then I can comment on what she says.
We'll do that as well. Francisca, you and your teams have been leading a lot of really deep work on resilience over the years, focusing on this region. And there's a great report that you put out earlier last year, which I encourage everybody to look at, From Risk to Resilience. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. Can you speak, Francisca, a little bit to what some of the lessons learned from the work that you've been doing, and what can India take away from that work as it thinks about incorporating resilience into the planning agenda here?
Thank you. Thank you. I'm glad you're asking me, because I think my angle is different from what most people have been discussing. We have deliberately focused on households and firms. So we've surveyed thousands of households in Bihar and elsewhere in South Asia, thousands of firms in Gujarat, Maharashtra, and Tamil Nadu. And we've asked them, are you affected already by climate change? The answer is yes. I'm not going to give you more numbers. We have firm level numbers too, to match the ones that Mr. Kishore mentioned. But the answer is yes, they're feeling it. Then we've asked them, what do you expect? And it turns out what they expect is exactly what the IPCC expects. They know what's coming. They have roughly similar expectations to expert forecasts of the number and the frequency and the severity of shocks. The third question we asked is, are you doing something about it? And it turns out, yes, they are already adapting. So 80% of households are already taking some sort of measure to protect themselves, and 2/3 of firms are already taking some sort of measure to protect themselves. So they are acting, they know what's coming. Households and small firms know what's coming, they're acting, they're adapting already. This is all good news. The catch is the way in which they adapt. When we ask them, what exactly do you do to adapt? That's where the problems arise. So households, both of them adapt in very sort of low-cost, basic ways. What households predominantly do, they plant trees. That's one of the most common measures. They build a ditch around the house. They raise the threshold of the house. So low-cost things that help, but are not that impactful. There are much more impactful ways of adapting. Firms mainly adapt through technology. So they buy a fan, they buy an AC. But they spend only 3% of their revenues on this. So this is one AC, this is one fan for the boss's office. This is not a major adaptation for all the workers in the shop. So that's the catch. And then we ask the fourth question, why? Why do you not adapt given that you're losing 17% per year on average in revenues on these climate shocks, at least for the firms, why don't you adapt more? Why don't you invest more? That's where development comes in. This is really where you see the synergies between development and climate adaptation. It's all the usual constraints to investment, any type of investment, including climate investment, climate adaptation investment. So it's access to finance that makes a difference. It's education, it's managerial practices, it's access to assets, wealth, savings, land. So it's the usual development constraints that prevent households and small-scale firms, at least the ones that we've interviewed, they all tended to be smaller. It's the usual development constraints that prevent them from adapting more, because they are adapting, but in a very basic manner. So that means for policy, the two policy priorities, and one is development. All policies that have double dividends for development and climate resilience, and then of course some climate-specific, resilience-specific policies. But I'm sure we'll get more into this.
Great. Thank you for that. I may turn it over to Dr. Anantha Nageswaran. Thank you for joining us. Maybe thinking about how we combine these synergies, as Francisca mentioned, around resilience and development. How do you see maybe climate resilience becoming a core part of India's growth strategy?
Thank you. First of all, my apologies to you, my fellow panelists, and to yourself, and to the other members of the audience for being late. An earlier meeting in the Cabinet Secretariat spilled over. So, first of all, wish you all a very happy new year. And regarding your question, I thought Francisca kind of stole almost all my lines. She spoke about acting, adapting, and she spoke about the various constraints that come in the way of adapting, which is basically capability, training, all those things that go to help them grow their business also help them adapt better. So obviously in the case of India, the answers naturally fall out from what she spoke. So a climate resilience strategy is one that basically generates the resources required through growth to be able to respond to mitigation down the road. In fact, I would basically say the resilience strategy is about building indigenous capabilities. Because as I was coming here on Bloomberg, I was reading this news item about the recent export licensing that China has introduced vis-a-vis Japan in the last couple of days. And the author of this article is clearly writing about what kind of response that Japan should adopt vis-a-vis China's latest bout of actions. And I quote, it's not my words, I quote, "The country," by that he means Japan, "the country is also consciously avoiding becoming further reliant on Beijing, while risking the ire of environmentalists. One key reason Japan is reluctant to further increase its solar capacity is the control that China exerts. Instead of, as Takeichi put it last year, covering our beautiful country with foreign-made solar panels, she has called for developing perovskite cells, a technology that can use indigenous materials that Japan hopes to commercialize. Similar concerns hang over a reluctance to fully embrace electric vehicles. Chinese dominance of battery technology risks another pressure point," unquote. So the climate resilience strategy, therefore, will be not only to develop indigenous capabilities in these areas, invest in R&D, and more importantly, when we indigenize and give them protection from foreign competition to the extent it is possible, we need to make sure that this is not open-ended, this is not interminable, and that the quality and the price points meet international competition. So in other words, a climate resilient strategy would depend on adaptation, would depend on building capabilities, as Francisco pointed out, in SMEs, and 3, to indigenize in areas where climate resilient practices do not depend on external sources, which have now become strategic weapons. These would be my response to your question.
Which in many ways is all the incoming theory for this work, right? Is indigenization of this manufacturing and now indigenization of the resilience agenda. If I can turn to our panelists here on Zoom, of course, finance is going to be key to a lot of this, and so let's turn to the banking sector. And as Vishwanathan, chairman of Axis Bank, also spent, I believe, 40 years at the Reserve Bank of India. So, of course, the banking sector is going to be critical in all of this, both on the manufacturing, but also on the resilience side. And so, a question for you, sir, from your perspective, how is the banking system responding to help bring these agendas forward, whether on the clean industrial growth, but also helping to manage risks and enable resilience in the economy?
Thank you. Happy New Year, and thanks for having me in this fantastic panel. I think what Mr. Kamal Kishore said is very important. The earlier approach to climate was, once there is a disaster, how to deal with it. So there's a lot of people who suffer loss either of life, of industry, of business. And the framework was to address those concerns in terms of how do they deal with the credit risk problem. That was how it was. But I think now there's a move towards building resilience, because it's one thing to be dealing with the problem when it has arisen, but other to prevent it to the extent possible. So at least in terms of what the Reserve Bank has been talking. So Reserve Bank has pursued this whole issue of climate risk as part of its both regulatory and supervisory process. And there is a lot of discussions in terms of what is expected of banks to prevent climate related disasters. It's even earlier, even before climate risk and these disasters became part of the global lexicon or thought process, there were a lot of instructions which RBI had given in terms of making banks sure that where they're lending to, say, seismically more active centers, flood-prone areas, what are the risks that they must assess while granting loans to people. And RBI has also added that, if I understand, of course now 4-5 years ahead, beyond since I left, but I think RBI is also including climate risk resilience as part of its assessment in terms of the ability of banks to manage risks. That's the second thing. Third part is, of course, from in terms of funding, there's a lot of support that RBI is wanting to give towards facilitating green technology. So RBI has come out with a paper or a regulation on green deposits, placing it in a different footing vis-a-vis others. And the paper says that they'll create a taxonomy on what will be the green projects to which this can be used. And last is, of course, even banks are raising funds. As I told you, I think Axis Bank has raised $500 million from IFC only for blue and green projects, so water-based and green projects. Next area where banks can do and banks are working, I think I can tell you on the basis of my own experience in Axis Bank, is that apart from lending, this work that is being done from the corporate social responsibility perspective, I think most of the banks are working using a big part of the funds under the corporate social responsibility to actually fund projects that are climate risk resilient, both in terms of building soil conservation, and developing mangroves in various parts of the country. So I think in terms of RBI's framework for banks to become a lot more climate risk aware in their credit process and the enabling environment for banks to finance green technology projects, things are moved. Another thing is, RBI we have a system, RBI has a system of priority sector lending. The priority sector lending includes, lending for what do you call startups. It's part of the priority sector. And I understand there are a lot of agri-techs in particular entities that are working in climate risk that are being financed by banks in this area. Last, I just read a news item which says that NABARD has created a fund, of 1,300 crores, proposed to create a fund, which will be used for startups which will work in agri-tech and climate risk areas, including actually high water conservation agriculture technology, and also those which will become more flood risk resilient. So there are some of things that are happening both from regulatory side, from the banking side, and also the Apex agriculture financing entity. So I think there's a lot more of awareness, at least as I can say, from all the stakeholders in the financial industry, and I think we are moving towards a situation where there is a clear understanding that one is to deal with a natural calamity post its occurrence, and it's more important to prevent the impact of such occurrences, because we may not be able to stop them because it may not be in our control, but at least how we can prevent the impact of them, like what Mr. Kishore was saying. I think there's an effort on the part of all stakeholders to move in that direction.
Great, thank you so much for that. So we've heard quite a range of perspectives here. Montek, if I can turn it to you, I was going to ask originally around how do we think about integrating all of this into a long-term planning strategy for a country like India?
Well, I mean, when you say integrating, I mean, I wasn't sure whether this session deals only with adjustment or it also includes mitigation. I mean, both are obviously important. But, from a planning point of view, I mean, clearly adjustment is important, but I think in a way the more challenging thing is mitigation. And mitigation is challenging, I think, for two reasons. I mean, one is, of course, we need to do a lot of mitigation ourselves. But, I mean, there's nothing that we can do by ourselves that will actually prevent climate change from happening. I mean, everybody has to cooperate. And the problem is that internationally, that consensus is at the moment quite frayed. And I have no idea really how the global economy is going to move forward on the mitigation front. But in our work, we're kind of assuming that this very frayed consensus at the moment will change for something more sensible 2 years from now, maybe 3 years from now. And then in that context, what should India do? Now, a colleague of mine at our institution and I have just finished a paper, and I think the most important point that we want to make is that even though the international consensus has frayed, and that should not be underestimated, and even though the international financing that's going to be available is nowhere near what has been talked about so far, nevertheless, India should remain on the target, remain with this target of getting to net zero by 2070. And I think it's probably true that the technology now makes it possible to do that. On adjustment, technology makes a lot of adjustment possible. But I think there the problem really is that people very rarely pay to avoid damage. I mean, that's why insurance is so difficult to spread. And that's a human trait. You kind of assume it's not going to happen to me. I mean, the best way of judging that is what's happening to people insuring their homes. And I mean, the second side of that same question is that if you want to provide insurance for the home, there would be universal happiness if the insurance was subsidized. That somehow Anand persuades the government to pay for the subsidy. But whether people would be willing to pay for the insurance themselves, that's the tough one. And then politically, it's even tougher if the rate at which you're going to charge for insurance is going to be a function of the risk involved, which would really mean that some houses would have to pay more for insurance if they're in an area more prone to disaster. And if you don't do that, then you'll basically see a lot of people not willing to insure because they're actually cross-subsidizing the more risky one. So that's pretty tough. Just limiting myself then to what we're looking at, I mean, the real issue is how do we stay on track to do our mitigation, meet our mitigation targets, because I think there the technology is changing. The trouble is we have to do a lot of things which are not that easy. And I mean, we can go on and on about it, but I don't know if it goes beyond the subject of this session. But I think if you're talking about planning for adjustment, then, I mean, some planning has to involve the government paying for these insurance schemes. Some planning has to involve investments that will reduce the risks of disaster. And the rest has to be privately borne risks where individuals share the cost. And you can subsidize those risks to some extent. But I suspect that it'll be a long time before people will actually take insurance against this. Remember, I mean, the science on the fact that you shouldn't eat too much, they should avoid obesity, etc., has been well known for a long time. But I mean, it doesn't stop people from doing all the wrong things. So you'll have the same thing here also. I mean, it's just a major effort in persuasion that can lead to different types of behavior. And that's tough.
Well, we don't want to end on that note. I think we want to look a bit to some of the solutions that we do have available for us. We know that behavior change is very difficult. We just enjoyed a very delicious lunch. I probably ate a bit more than I should have. But I think bringing up insurance actually is a good segue into thinking about things that we can do on the resilience front in terms of anticipatory or preventative action. Because with insurance, there are also sometimes incentives to do the work to reduce the risks, to reduce your insurance premiums. I may ask you, Kamal, I know in your office there is a lot of emphasis on early warning systems and anticipatory action. Are there things that we can learn from the preventative side or the preparedness frameworks that we can bring on board here in India and help reduce some of the risks from climate impacts?
I think I would say that any investment that we make in strengthening early warning systems it's the best value for money you can get, the best return on investment. In the last 20 years, we invested in improving forecasting and warning capacity of the IMD, and the investment that we made in improving the capacities of IMD for cyclone forecasting, it has paid for itself in just 2 or 3 big events. And after that, it's all, some more. It's all profit now. So it's really great. But what I would emphasize is that we can't just stop at improving early warning systems for cyclones. It has to be for multiple hazards. We have to invest much more in improving forecast for glacial lake outburst floods. We know what happened in 2023, October glacial lake outburst flood, where hydroelectric dams were washed away. 20 years of investment washed away in 30 minutes. So it's really important that we strengthen early warning systems for other hazards like glacial lake outburst floods, flash floods. Urban flood is becoming a major problem now. The NDMA, the National Disaster Management Authority, is supporting 7 cities, but this really needs to be scaled. It's not just a problem of large cities, it's also a problem of small cities. Every day, every year, there are at least 2 cities in India that have massive urban flood. So what I would emphasize is that now in early warning area, we really have to go beyond cyclone early warning to looking at all multiple hazards, strengthening end-to-end early warning systems, not just looking at what is happening on the hydromet end, but also what is happening at the level of its implementation at the local level. Having said that, early warning is not enough. In the long run, we have to get our infrastructure story built in a way that it is resilient to hazards of now as well as into the future. That requires work, that requires improving our understanding of risk, improving our standards and codes. Just last month, India released its revised zonation of seismic hazard, for example. We need to do the same for floods and winds and for extreme heat. Extreme heat is a major problem. So it's really important that we Do not focus just on early warning system, multi-hazard early warning system, but deep risk reduction, embedding resilience in every rupee we spend on building our infrastructure systems. Thank you very much.
Please.
Just want to make one point that, there's no question that early warning systems are extremely valuable and probably they're the best use of money to begin with. But remember, early warning systems save lives of people, that's important. Also saves lives of livestock, which is kind of getting into the more productive, that's also important. It doesn't do anything to prevent damage to buildings. So and infrastructure. So really the only way of handling that is if you go into preventive investment, anticipating where you're going to have floods and what do you need to do to prevent that. That is hugely complicated. But that's a public good, and that somehow should be financed. I'm not sure, obviously every government will do, every state government should do what it can. But I don't know whether there's any international willingness to finance, since the issue of mitigation has now become controversial, in the sense some important members of the international community are actually denying the science behind global warming. So I assume there won't be much progress there for a while. But I think on the issue of damage, there's at the moment not that much doubt. The point being that everybody agrees that floods have increased, and you can keep your opinions open on what's causing it, but it's happening, and there's no doubt about that. So the question is there any major international effort possible to persuade countries to do the investment needed to prevent damage? Saving lives and giving early warning is useful. It's been quite useful in India because, some of the early warning systems have prevented what in earlier years would have led to a lot of loss of life and livestock.
Anantha, what about that? What is the role, do you think, around the planning and the siting of infrastructure?
No, I think what Montek sir pointed out, in fact, when I was listening to him, he said adjustment and mitigation, and I heard it as adjustment and litigation. And in the current circumstances, probably it's appropriate to to think of it as that way. Many things are now being litigated with respect to climate change. But then I realized that you're talking about mitigation. So I think, so the two things, and Montek sir also pointed out towards the end that there is a denial of science. But there's one area where science is very clear, that climate change is a reality. Where there is another area where science is not denying, but it is still contested, and that point has to be understood, is that the extent of anthropomorphic contribution to global warming, because global cycles of climate happened even when the global population was a fraction, very minuscule fraction of what it is today. So in that sense, what kind of adaptation becomes important, that is where I agree with him about the role of insurance, although in general in India, penetration of insurance is very low, whether it is health or life or non-life, and therefore to get them to insure against climate change risks will take a lot of education and doing, and maybe more than education and nudging through tax or non-tax means. Ultimately, when people actually experience a shock, that is when they will learn to unfortunately close the door after the horse had bolted. Now, also with respect to understanding why adaptation and insurance matter more than what we think, just to give you some statistics. To generate 1 gigawatt of solar power, we require 18.5 tons of silver, 2,000 to 3,000 tons of polysilicon, and 10,252 tons of aluminium. Now, producing just this polysilicon, which is about 2,000 to 3,000 tons of polysilicon, you require 8,112 tons of quartz, 2,028 tons of coal, 1,449 tons of petroleum coke, and 5,121 tons of charcoal, and 2,230 tons of wood chips. Now, therefore, to make the 1 gigawatt of solar power, 18.5 tons of silver I mentioned, and that in turn requires 4,625 megawatt of power, which is the yearly power consumption of between 350 to 400 American households. And then producing the aluminium that is required with this 10,252 tons multiplied by 190 gigajoules per ton requires almost 2 million gigajoules, equivalent to the yearly electricity consumption of over 100,000 average households. Now, I can give you reel of more statistic with respect to the amount of copper required to produce 1 gigawatt of wind power, and we all know that the copper yield is 0.6%. So what I'm trying to say is, when we talk of adaptation and mitigation in turn, we immediately turn to renewable energy, which is solar and wind. To generate 1 gigawatt of renewable energy, so much of energy has to be expended first. Is that the right way? Especially when the anthropogenic contribution to climate change, which is a reality, it is still contested. And there is a cost benefit to, and the trade-off to allocating your scarce fiscal resources in the developing world where growth is equally important, without which there is no public ownership of climate goals. So therefore, in my opinion, the climate resilience strategy involves A, adaptation, B, economic growth, 3, generation of resources, then you invest in a range of fossil fuels, of which solar and wind will be a small part. There will be hydro, there will be hydrogen, there will be nuclear, etc. So this is the way I think developing countries have to prioritize their climate strategy. Back to you.
So we have just a couple minutes left here. I know, Francisca, you wanted to come in, and then we'll give NS a chance to maybe close us out, but please.
I just want to give some examples for what Ananta just said. We've done a thorough, comprehensive review of the literature of any study in any country over the last 20 years on policies on adaptation by households and firms. So it's really a private sector thing. And we've estimated in a meta-regression analysis that the damage of climate shocks can be reduced by about half with certain strategies. The most effective strategy that households have is public goods. And that's not just social benefits, that's actually resilient, not even resilient public infrastructure. So let me give you 3 examples. It's just development infrastructure. If there is a second road, whether it's resilient or not, one road can flood, the other is still there to let people go to markets or hospitals or get inputs, not the suppliers can come in. Local health clinics are associated with much lower infant mortality when you have floods. Piped water is also associated with that. Piped water remains clean when you have a flood. So basic development policy, to come back to your quandary about what can you do about adaptation, what can policy do? Basic development policies that have these double dividends are incredibly powerful for adaptation.
Thank you for that, and I encourage everybody to follow up on the great research that Francisca's team has done. Our time here is up, so I will ask NS just for a very, very quick final thought to get us going, summarizing, so that we can conclude our panel.
Yeah, I think, as I said, the current approach of regulation, banking regulation, is to make banks and regulatory entities aware of the climate risk and dovetail that into their overall credit policies, number one. Number two, there's also clear understanding on the part of the regulators that it's not just dealing with a climate event that needs to be done, but there is a lot of support that has to be provided to prevent those climate events. While it's equally important to reduce the adverse impact of those climate events, which sometimes may not be able to be stopped. So this is what is happening, but I think a lot more has to be done. This lot more whether RBI can make regulations that will facilitate improving resilience, adaptations. Those are things which obviously are, to my knowledge, in the works, as I understand. But I think as we go forward, and I agree with Montek sir that the whole issue of what the globe is thinking and what we should do is a larger issue. But I think we have decided to go and go in the path that we have taken. So possibly the Reserve Bank will also adapt its policies to move in that direction. I'll put it that way. Great.
Well, I want to thank this great panelists for these insights. I think what's clear coming out of this is that this is not, there's no silver bullet for any of these things. It requires a lot of integration, both on the mitigation side and also on the adaptation side. But I think I have faith that sort of people here in India and Indian leadership is going to show us a viable path forward and really lead the world. So thank you for our panelists. Thank you for joining us here and virtually. And with that, we're going to move on to the next panel. Thank you.